we are very clear that Assad cannot be part of the long-term future in Syria. But I don't think that means we should stop talking to the Russians.
Hosted by the UN Secretary-General, the all-important toast between Presidents Obama and Putin was obscured by photographers.
And to the United Nations.
But here's one of their photos. You can almost feel the chill. A stony-faced Barack Obama raising his glass to a leader who he regards as a dangerous force prepared to risk global disorder for his own ends. In case you missed the coolness, this was the handshake before their bilateral meeting. The meeting itself ran long, an hour and a half. The Russian leader bounded out with a sunny view of what just happened.
Today's discussion was very constructive and surprisingly open. We have a lot in common, but disputes remain. They're well known, and there's no need to talk about them again. But in my opinion, we have sound grounds to work on points of concern together.
The morning after, the US Secretary of State gave his version of the way things now stand.
There's an agreement that Syria should be a unified country, united, that it needs to be secular, that ISIL needs to be taken on, and that there needs to be a managed transition. But there is a difference, obviously, in what that means and what that outcome may or may not be.
The diplomatic manoeuvring in New York feels a long way from this. But it is the ease with which President Assad has launched barrel bombs onto civilian areas which prevents Western leaders from openly supporting any plan that relies on keeping him in place. Vladimir Putin's appearance at the UN has placed Russia firmly at the heart of any deal that might be done. Tactically, nothing can be done about Assad without Moscow's intervention.
Good morning.
Over on the other front, the coalition attempting to degrade and destroy the Islamic State group met for talks, the American president pressing home his message on the Syrian leader.
In Syria, as I said yesterday, defeating ISIL requires, I believe, a new leader, an inclusive government that unites the Syrian people in the fight against terrorist groups. This is going to be a complex process. And as I've said before, we are prepared to work with all countries, including Russia and Iran, to find a political mechanism in which it is possible to begin a transition process.
In the courtyard of the United Nations building here stands a vast statue of St. George slaying the dragon, the work of a Russian artist. Had Putin glimpsed it, he may have seen himself triumphant. But the stark reality is this meeting will conclude with a war still raging in Syria and refugees fleeing that terrible violence. Whether the world has inched closer to doing anything about it is not yet clear. Now, earlier I spoke with Britain's Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond and began by asking him whether Russia is simply filling the vacuum left by the inaction of others, the US and the UK among them.
By reinforcing the Assad regime, he has changed the dynamics on the ground. He's shored up the morale of regime forces. But we haven't finished exploring with the Russians yet what exactly this means, where exactly they are hoping to go. So we're still at the moment hoping that we can turn this Russian intervention into a positive feature, using the leverage that the Russians undoubtedly have.
What leverage do you have, though, when it comes to dealing with President Putin? I mean, he's made it very clear that he will not entertain any kind of cooperation unless it underpins and furthers the presidency of Assad. I mean, he's got you in a very difficult place, hasn't he?
Look, the Russians are taking some risks as well by reinforcing their presence in Syria. It's quite a while ago, but the experience of the 1970s, 80s in Afghanistan is still a very real and present feature of Russian collective memory. And I think Putin, for all his tough words, will be quite reluctant to allow himself to be drawn in to a situation as messy as the one in Syria. So we hope that actually the Russians are looking for an agreed way forward. Clearly, we've all got our red lines. At the moment, Putin is saying he wants to shore up the Assad regime. We are very clear that Assad cannot be part of the long-term future in Syria. But I don't think that means we should stop talking to the Russians about areas of possible collaboration.
And there's a big difference between talking and there being momentum towards a peace deal. For the people who remain in Syria, who are suffering with these barrel bombs, who are suffering the double threat of the Islamic State, I mean, what comfort can they draw from this kind of international talk fest that anything significant is going to emerge? There's a lot of kind of strategic talk about, you know, moving pawns on a chessboard, but these aren't pawns, this is a country and people.
Of course, that's right. And look, what we would like to come away from here with is some kind of agreement with the Russians about how we are going to move forward to end this conflict. But at the very least, I would like to come away with an assurance, perhaps private, from the Russians that they will use the influence that they undoubtedly have to end the barrel bombing, end the chlorine attacks, end the worst excesses of the regime. The Russians' reputation is now unavoidably linked to the actions of the regime. And I hope that for all the bluster, President Putin will also see that Russia will be damaged if these kind of horrific, inhuman attacks are allowed to continue.
Americans are being criticised for the failure of the train and assist program and the fact that a lot of the material they've provided to the moderate Syrians have ended up in the hands of al-Nusra. Now, the British have also supplied, you know, non-lethal support to Syrian moderates. Do we know whose hands that equipment is now in?
We have no reason to believe that any significant part of the equipment that we've donated has gone anywhere we wouldn't want it to go.
Some of it may have, though.
Well, we can't rule that out. Of course, we're not present on the battlefield and we don't have sort of inventory control of every item. Inevitably, in this kind of civil war situation, that's not a practical proposition.